Yes, absolutely. And also you are an expert with regards to what's going on with Russia and Ukraine. Alexander was saying before we started recording this video, Alexander was saying that he's a huge fan of yours. I know you've written many books. Can you just introduce some of your work very, very quickly before we get into the topic?
Sure. Well, my first books were mostly about the European-Russian relationship after the Cold War, how the inability to effectively reach a post-Cold War settlement for Europe and the conflict this resulted in. And thereafter, I began to write some books on this Greater Eurasian Partnership, which Russia began to develop after the events of 2014. Thereafter, I've written some books on Russian conservatism, geoeconomics in the Fourth Industrial Revolution, and various books on Russian foreign policy. And one of the most recent one was a book called Europe as the Western Peninsula of Greater Eurasia, which explores how this Greater Eurasian Partnership is affecting Europe. And in June, in 3 months, I will have there's a new book coming out called Russophobia, which looks at political propaganda in the international system. So mostly the Western propaganda against Russia, but not only recent, but more of a phenomenon really picking up in the 1800s.
Yeah. All right. So I'll put all your links in the description box down below for people to follow you, as well as links for your books and for your work. And Alexander, I will turn it over to you and to Glenn. And I think the first thing we need to talk about are the talks that are taking place right now as we're recording this video in Turkey between the Russians and the Ukrainians. What's going on? How do you see things?
Well, I think that the Ukrainians have at some level intellectually accepted that Ukraine is never going to join NATO. I think this has been something that they've intellectually accepted, but they've never actually, I think, seen through the logic of what that means. So they're coming up with various proposals to the Russians about what they call neutral status, except I suspect that when you pour into these proposals in detail, you find that in fact it's not really neutral status at all. It would still be a Ukraine essentially very heavily aligned with the Western powers. And I very, very much doubt that. I think it's inconceivable that the Russians will accept that. So the Ukrainians have come up with more proposals on this. I think the Russians will do what they always do. They will look at these proposals, they'll come back, they'll say whether or not they are prepared to move forward with them. But in that, whatever form the Ukrainians come up with, I don't think that the Russians will simply accept these proposals as they stand. Now, I'm sure there's other things going on. There's lots of things that are also being discussed about, Ukraine's military position, its armed forces, bases in Ukraine, the status of the Russian language in Ukraine, denazification, as the Russians call it in Ukraine, all of these things, the status of Donbass, the status of Crimea. I think we are, if I may say so very much, at an early start of negotiations. But I think also you might just see some proposals about humanitarian corridors and local ceasefires in some of the northern Ukrainian cities. But the major battle in the Donbass, where it's going on, will probably continue until it's finally completed. So that's what I think. I mean, in other words, glacial progress in negotiations, with the Ukrainians intellectually accepting that they're not going to join NATO, but unwilling to face up to what that means in substantive terms.
Glenn, your take.
I largely agree, or completely agree, because I think to understand the way the Russian red lines go, so what they completely demand, you have to look at what the problem is. And I think this also goes back to 2014, and this is something that NATO always recognized as a challenge as well. If they're going to expand towards Russian borders, it has certain problems because Ukraine's been very divided. So I think for this reason, two problems have emerged when you try to bring Ukraine into a divided Ukraine into the Western Bloc. The first one is obviously that the eastern parts, the Russian-speaking part, that they would face some oppression in terms of media, within media politics, etc. But the second, obviously, having this American and NATO military infrastructure moving closer towards Russian borders. So for this reason, this is the two things very important to Russia. They need a neutral Ukraine, not hosting these American weapons, but also they need some protection for the Russian speakers. So this is largely what was brought into the Minsk II agreement, which they tried to push through for these 7 years, which was, have some autonomy for Donbass, and this autonomy would have allowed also Ukraine prevent NATO from expanding. But as they saw, it became slowly a de facto member by arming it. So I think that this has been the three main goals they've had since the conflict began. That is, they demand a neutral Ukraine, but after they went to war, they also then want independence for Donbass, and also this third category, as Alexander mentioned, there's denazification. I think it's probably deliberate, ambiguous. I think mainly what it's a reference to is all of these groups like Azov and Aidar, all this using these fascist logos, they were integrated into the army, the Ukrainian army, so they would like to have them pushed out of the state structures. This is obviously because they brought a lot of misery for people in eastern Ukraine. But also there could be something strategic behind this. If they would decouple the fascist elements from the Ukrainian government, they would likely turn a bit on each other, which would obviously be favorable to Russia as well. So, but I'm just wondering how this agreement will be cemented. If, let's say, even if we look at one simple thing like neutrality, how would this be organized in an agreement? Because it feels like the era of diplomacy is over. Keep in mind, the Europeans signed a deal with Donbass in 2000. With Russia and Ukraine in 2014, that they would have unity government, but then within 48 hours, the Europeans ignored it and supported the coup. And then in 2015, you had this Minsk II agreement, which had a peaceful settlement for Ukraine. And then they spent the past 7 years torpedoing this agreement, undermining it. So I think it's going to be very hard to, I guess the Russian fear, what would prevent them from agreeing to anything is as soon as they have an agreement, you'll be neutral. What's stopping them from the US from pumping weapons in again and then backtracking on all this commitment? So there's no trust anymore in the system. That's what I mean. It's all our pan-European security agreements have collapsed over the years. So it's very clear to me how these agreements would be put into words. And that's just the Russian side. Of course, the Ukrainians have their own security concerns, and they would like, if Russia has its security concerns recognized in agreements, then the Ukrainians will want the same. So I think it's difficult. And the point I've been continuously making is the longer this conflict goes on, the more resource it pushes into this conflict, the more it will demand in return. So in other words, on day one, if Ukraine would have surrendered, they could have maybe agreed to neutral Ukraine and then independence for and recognize Donbass and Crimea, just so this conflict won't fire up again. But now, if Russia is taking over more and more territory, at some point they're going to start to install local governance of people who are not favorable of the government in Kyiv. And at this point, they can't be left to their own anymore, if you will. So I think the longer this conflict goes on, the less favorable terms the Russian will agree to. That's my perception, at least.
I think this is exactly correct. I think it is also, by the way, an important point to understand, because I think the Western perception is almost the diametric opposite, that time is somehow on Ukraine's side, whereas the reality is the diametric contrary. The longer Ukraine holds out, the more it resists coming to terms with the Russians, the more difficult the terms Ukraine will have to accept will be. And I think this is absolutely kept true. But if we go back to Glenn's points, it seems to me that Glenn has put his finger on the whole underlying problem in Ukraine. There are two problems in Ukraine. There's an internal political problem in Ukraine, the profound division within Ukrainian society between Ukrainian speakers, Russian speakers. In my opinion, after the Soviet Union broke up, that could have been settled. There could have been all kinds of arrangements made. It could have been resolved in a peaceful and friendly way between communities which have lived together for centuries and in many cases share the same faiths and even sometimes the same ideological opinions. What exacerbated these problems within Ukraine itself to the point of absolute breakdown and war, and what ultimately involved Russia too, was this extraordinary push by the Western powers ever further east into the former Soviet Union. So we've had NATO expansion into first the Baltic states, and to be straightforward about this, talk about NATO expansion into Ukraine. At that summit, that disastrous summit in Bucharest, they actually said that Ukraine would one day become a member of NATO. They've constantly said that doesn't really mean anything, but why would the Russians believe them when they say that it won't mean anything? So the constant push eastward of NATO, and I think also similarly, the constant push eastward of the European Union, which has gone hand in hand with all of this. And that has been incredibly destabilizing within Ukraine itself. It's created immense polarizations and tensions within Ukraine, as many Russian-speaking Ukrainians have felt that this is a policies that are being forced on them, both by internal Ukrainian politicians that take a pro-Western perspective and who want to impose the Ukrainian language and de-Russify Ukraine. So that's one part of it. But it's also massively alarmed Russia also, who see, of course, Ukraine as for whom Ukraine is an existential issue. So I think we've seen these two things come together. And I think at a fundamental level, European leaders, especially, have never really understood the danger in what they've been doing. I think they've always assumed that they could push east, that they could support political forces in Ukraine, that they could ignore agreements that they've reached with the Russians, that they could simply keep this agenda constantly moving eastwards, and that sooner or later the Russians would accept it. And I think that it's now ended in a massive bang, a terrible war, a war which is going to have disastrous consequences, and which it is now clear is going to have enormous effects on the European economy, which I think European leaders had not anticipated or predicted. So that's, I think, where we are. But it is this policy discussed at great length by Glenn in books, articles, pushing eastward, ignoring Russian concerns, ignoring many internal Ukrainian concerns, not recognizing or realizing where this was all going to end.
Right. Going back to what you said, Glenn, I have a question for both of you. Why should Russia at this moment in time accept any type of agreement, given everything that's happened to them? I mean, they've been canceled out of the Western architecture. That's clear. I mean, there's nothing for them to lose anymore, is there? There's always the fear of false flags and obviously some sort of NATO intervention or a wider war, or God forbid, a nuclear war. But why should they accept any kind of ceasefire or peace deal? Because it's like you said, whatever they accept at this moment in time from Ukraine is hollow. There's no trust there anymore. And the U.S. has said that they will not stop. In so many words, they said they will not stop until they achieve regime change. I mean, Sullivan said this is going to be a long war and we're committed to it. I mean, they're not going to stop, whether it's this year or in 5 years or in 10 years. So my question is, why should Russia not go all the way with this operation?
Well,
to Glenn and Alexander,
But Glenn, do you want to start?
Yeah, well, I agree that that for Russia they see this in a much wider context, which is why they are so very unlikely to want to yield anything or on this conflict, because from Russia's perspective, this conflict is not primarily about Ukraine. Ukraine is becoming a symptom of a larger problem. That is, when the Cold War came to an end, initially we had disagreements with the Russians that we would have this common European security architecture. We signed all these deals through the 90s in which we would have indivisible security, so one side should not expand security at the expense of the other. We were all committed to not having any more dividing lines altogether. But then, of course, this is what NATO expansion represented for the Russians. It was canceling the idea of a common Europe. And effectively, what does it mean if we in the West said, well, we're still going to have the dividing lines, we're just going to move them towards the East? The problem then is we restart a lot of the same dynamic of the Cold War, but except for having fights around the Third World, well, what we're fighting now for is where to draw these new dividing lines in Europe. And again, this is the reason why we have been fighting in Georgia, Ukraine, also conflict Moldova. We're trying to establish where the new dividing lines are on the continent. So so even if this kind of war would be over tomorrow, the underlying dynamics are still there. We're still going to compete for where the dividing lines should be drawn. So that's the military aspect, and I don't think. Again, unless we would go back to the problems made in the 1990s and come up with some real pan-European security deals, I don't think much can be done. In other words, in terms of the sanctions, I think also Russia is full in on this, because they're not sitting there waiting for sanctions to be removed so they can crawl back to the West. Instead, what Russia articulated very clearly in 2014, when the West first supported the toppling Yanukovych, was that they'd given up on this greater Europe that started from Gorbachev, and they instead began to embrace this idea of the greater Eurasian partnership. So Europe was replaced with Asia, Germany as the core was replaced with China, and they're now starting to see this to some extent as an opportunity to have this for full decoupling and lean more towards Asia. So I don't see why Russia giving any way. And again, this is not a normative argument. I just want to make that point, because usually when you, at least in this country, there's a bit of a lynching mood going on, and whenever you say something how Russia thinks, it's immediately seen as legitimizing something. I'm just saying they're not normative arguments, are right or wrong, just what Russian arguments or perspectives are and why they're acting the way they are.
Sorry, am I? Yes, I think that there is a kind of logic for the Russians to press on to the conclusion, and that may very well be what they come to. I mean, it may very well be that eventually they will come to some kind of regime change decision in Ukraine, because they may very well decide that any agreement they reach with Ukraine, any agreement they reach with the Western powers, will not be an acceptable agreement. But the Russians always have to balance opinion, not just within Russia, but in the outside world. They have to keep people like the Chinese, the Indians on side, and they have always worked. And this is a point that I really cannot emphasize again too strongly. I mentioned this right at the start of this program, that the Russians, I think, genuinely do not want to take over the whole of Ukraine. I think that they would see this as a burden on themselves at this time. What they want to do is to take this problem of Ukraine, that has been such a huge problem for them ever since basically the Soviet Union ended, and this problem of NATO eastward expansion, off the table, so that they can go ahead and deal with their pressing internal problems. Now, if they can achieve this by a combination of force and negotiation, I think they will do it, rather than go full out for total victory. But if they can't achieve it through that combination of force and negotiation, then of course force remains ultimately something that they can always continue to apply. Now, we've had more information that's come out over the last few minutes. Apparently Ukrainians have come up with some proposals. The Russians are talking about scaling down their operations in Chernigov and around Kiev. But it's important to say that the main focus at the battle, which is Donbass. There the fight goes on, and that's where the bulk of the Ukrainian army is, and that's where most of the fighting will continue. And there's absolutely no ceasefire there, and I predict that will continue until either the Ukrainians finally do come to terms, or until the war itself ends, from the Russian point of view, in victory.
I think many people are going to interpret what you said, Alexander and Glenn, and they're going to say that, in Russia at least, they're going to say that the West cannot be trusted with a ceasefire or with terms of a negotiation. What do you say about that?
I think they don't trust the West anymore, and Glenn has explained why. We've had one treaty and agreement after another. NATO made all those promises. The West made all those promises at the end of the Cold War. Not an inch east. They pretend they didn't make those promises, which must be even more insulting to the Russians, to be told that those promises were never made when they obviously and manifestly were. But not an inch east was broken. Then there was all those arms control agreements, agreements about restrictions on size of conventional forces, promises that NATO would convert itself less from an alliance, a military alliance, towards a more political structure, whatever that meant. There was the NATO-Russia Founding Act. There was the NATO-Russia Council set up. There was the INF Treaty, which was then scrapped. All of these agreements have been scrapped. So why should the Russians trust the West? I mean, it doesn't make any kind of sense from a Russian point of view that they would want to trust the West. And so I'm sure that they don't trust the West. But if they can do a deal with Ukraine, which they can be reasonably confident that Ukraine would stick to, well, that's another issue.
I'll say it again. Glenn, they were confident that the Minsk Accords would be followed. I mean, Germany and France, they signed on to it.
Yeah, well, I think this is the main experience. What Russia's been complaining about for 30 years now is they sign all these agreements with the West, but one after the other, they're all they see the West as simply changing realities on the ground, and then effectively saying that these agreements doesn't matter anymore. And I think Alexander is very correct. I mean, this not 1 inch to the east, which Gorbachev got, this agreement was very clear, but still this is now denied. But again, all these pan-European security agreements in the 90s, we now just pretend that they never happened, that NATO expansion doesn't undermine Russian security. And yes, Alexander also pointed to this Russia-NATO Founding Act of 97. This was supposed to calm down the Russians, saying, okay, listen, we're going to expand anyways, but we promise not to put any permanent combat troops in the new member states. Well, now NATO is saying we can't discriminate against all the new members, which effectively say we're not going to follow this either. And again, yes, the Minsk agreement, just agreement after agreement, you see from ABM Treaty, INF, all of them we have kind of abandoned. So I think from Russia's perspective, there can't be any trust because there's no balance. So when, for example, NATO say they want to negotiate from a position of strength, this is a very hegemonic thought. And from my perspective, this has been some of the problems we had since the 90s, because if NATO is dominant and it negotiates only from a position of strength, this means that NATO can do effectively what it wants. Meanwhile, none of Russia's security concern have been taken into account for 30 years. Now, I'm not saying that legitimizes any actions by Russia. I'm just saying that that's how they reach this conclusion, that if they want to have security, then they have to pursue it by force. So I don't think there's any trust there. And as I mentioned before, I think this is part of the problem with coming with a diplomatic agreement, because if every agreement is signed with the West and we don't honor that agreement, what's the point? You can't have agreements based on trust anymore. They need to have some other solution in place, and I think that's probably, and this will dominate the logic in Russia of what kind of post-war settlement they will accept. And just last note, I couldn't agree more that I think the narrative is very strange at the moment. This idea that Russia has been losing. I think if you see what's happening in Donbass now, I think all the Russian pieces that Russia needs are now falling into place.
Yeah.
In the next week or two, I think the situation will be dramatically changed.
I agree. Yeah, I mean, I agree with that. Can I also say that clearly there is no trust in the West, and in advance of these negotiations in Istanbul, the Russians made it absolutely clear that they do not want Western powers participating in the negotiations. They will deal directly with the Ukrainians, but they do not want any Western interlocutors any longer involved in the talks. So it is now purely a negotiation, a direct negotiation between Russia and Ukraine. And we'll see whether they come to any kind of agreement, but it will have to be an agreement which the Russians believe that they can rely upon. And that, I suspect, is going to be very difficult because, of course, Ukraine itself is a complex country, to put it mildly. The political system there is particularly complex. But as Glenn correctly said, the Ukrainians are facing a military catastrophe, and I really want to emphasize this, in Donbass, and that may be concentrating minds. Now, the Russian negotiator, Medinsky, said that the Ukrainians have for the first time come up with a coherent proposal, and that's going to be relayed to Putin. So we'll see what that means and what that proposal amounts to, and whether it's anything that the Russians can practically work with.
Medinsky says that they are going to be reducing their military activities near Kiev and Chernigov, like you said, Alexander. Is this a mistake, guys? Is this a mistake for them? Does this take out the momentum? Does the Western media, one final question, does the Western media spin this as a narrative where you see the Russians were losing in Kiev and they were getting beaten back by the Ukraine military, so now Ukraine got what they wanted during the negotiations, and the Russians have to retreat east? Well, I mean, is this a losing point for the Russians and Putin?
It's not a losing point. They're not conceding anything because they haven't made any attempt, as we've discussed so many times in so many programs, to storm either Kiev or Chernigov or any of these places. The reason that they're doing that is because they want to, close down these fronts because they've now basically managed to isolate the Ukrainian army in Donbass. So from their point of view, it's a symbolic concession that means nothing in terms of where the main battle is happening. Now, how the West spins it is not something, I think, that is within Russia's control. And I mean, the West hardly reports the fighting in the Donbass at all, hardly reports the situation even in Mariupol in any substantive way. So given that is so, I don't think the Russians are particularly bothered about what the West spins about this.
I agree. I think I've been cautioning about the same, what I would consider to be wishful thinking, because you see this argument coming that, every time you look up in the media, they suggest that the Russian storming of Minsk and of Kyiv is being pushed back, but they never received any orders to storm Kyiv. That would require a lot of bombing and initial preparation. So I think people will miss the fact that over the past 8 years, the war has been fought in Donbass. And this is where Ukrainian forces mobilized in the tens of thousands. This is where the Ukrainian best military forces are as well. This is also where more of the vicious and fierce forces, being Azov and the rest, are also concentrated. So this is the main battlefield, which is Donbass. So I think now that this conflict in Donbass is reaching an end, we see like final stand now in the area around the Kramatorsk. I think that this will change the entirety, because once they defeat the Ukrainian army in Donbass with the tens of thousands of forces being lost there, that will free up a huge amount of Russian Chechen troops, which can then be put further pressure on the Ukrainian state. Also, I always point out that wars are largely about logistics, and part of the reason why Russia hasn't gone in so far yet is because it needs to keep its what we call supply chains, Yes, it's a supply
Russian, yeah.
yes, supply chains open for your gasoline and armament, and Mariupol has been a key problem in this, from connecting Donbass with Kherson and Crimea. But my point is, once that the Donbass issue is resolved for the Russians, the whole logistic issue also itself. So the primary objective of Russia to capture Donbass is resolved. You can then connect these regions within Ukraine, and this is going to change pretty much everything. So, I don't think if they pulling a bit back from Kyiv, if this helps to facilitate some negotiations. I think I don't see it making. I don't see this as a withdrawal or a defeat. I think that again, this belongs to the realm of the information war, not the actual war.
Absolutely. Can I just also say that apparently Ukraine has also to offer to discuss the Crimean question. So we'll see what they're doing. Something that they've absolutely refused to do up to this point. So we'll see where all this goes. But at the moment, it seems as if actually Ukraine has given some ground in these negotiations. But as you absolutely rightly said, Alex, I think there's very little trust. And of course, what they're also trying to do is they're trying to freeze out, to the extent that they possibly can, the Western powers, to prevent the Western powers interfering in these negotiations, which I think would complicate them and make them very difficult.
But how do you freeze out the West after all of this concludes? Because I'll go back to my first question, to my first point, my first question. The neocons are not going to go away. They're not going anywhere. And they've been very clear, crystal clear. They will not end until they get regime change in Russia.
Yeah.
So, I mean, how do you freeze them out of Ukraine? How do you end this? How do you stop them with their fixation on destroying Russia? I'm trying to figure it out. Even a negotiated settlement in Ukraine, to me, seems like, okay, maybe it's a temporary pause in the neocons' plans, but it's not going to stop them. I mean, in 3, 4, 5 years, it's just going to come back again. And like Glenn said, they'll try to do another coup. They'll try to do another regime change, and they'll try to stir things up again.
It's a fundamental problem that the Russians have, and one must be very clear. I think that they basically want to resolve the situation in Ukraine, but the longer, greater problem of the pressure from the United States, of course, that can't be resolved in this kind of way. But that's where we come back to Glenn's major topic, which is the Greater Eurasian Partnership, the alliance with China, or at least the de facto the strategic partnership with China, the forging of deeper economic links, the setting up of alternative financial systems, all of those kind of things. That I think is the ultimate long-term game plan. But they have to resolve the situation in Ukraine, because if they don't, then that's going to be the major immediate problem for them. So I think that's what that's what I think the ultimate Russian game plan is. Because if the Ukrainians draw back, if they don't move forward with these proposals that they're apparently making, if they prevaricate further on NATO membership, if they try to get a kind of NATO membership which isn't a formal membership but which appears to be that, well, at that point, of course, the Russians, as I said, will eventually impose their own decision, their own outcome on the situation in Ukraine, and then the negotiations will fall apart. But if they can separate Ukraine, the Ukrainian problem, from the greater global problem of this confrontation with the West and the United States, then, as I said, it will put them in a stronger position going forward as they forge ahead with their Greater Eurasian Partnership with Russia, with China, as they bind together Central Asia, the Caucasian states, and perhaps some of the other Central Asian states outside what was the Soviet Union, Iran, Turkey, and the rest.
Glenn, what do you think about that? And do you think that if Putin does agree to these terms. And just to let you guys know, I'm on Telegram and Twitter, and I'm seeing the reaction, especially from the Russian side of things, from people that are just chiming in, anecdotal, of course, but people are very upset with Russia possibly agreeing to these terms. I think this has been exacerbated by the POW video and all of these things that have come out. I mean, there's a lot of emotion now in this, but I'm telling you right now, if these are the terms that Russia decides to agree on, security guarantees, having countries actually be able to impose no-fly zones like China, Turkey, Israel, etc.
Well, we don't know
the ceasefire. We don't know. This is anecdotal. Once again, this is I'm just giving you guys the vibe of what I'm seeing right now as this stuff is trickling in. There's a lot of anger from the Russian side of things that, you know what, if Putin agrees to this, then we're going to get betrayed again. We're going to get screwed over. I'm just reading you guys what I'm seeing right now.
Yeah.
Well, that's the interesting part when we in the West dream about this regime change in Moscow. We often forget that Putin is not really considered part of the hardliners in Russia. I mean, if he goes out, there's not going to be a more liberal, Western-friendly leader in place. So, but I think this some of this anger could, again, it goes back to this idea that the problem in Ukraine is a double problem. On one hand, you have this divided Ukraine, which they want to have a solution to, but it's also in conflict with Russia. But this is a symptom of this larger problem, which is that of a divided Europe. And one has to be honest that the U.S. objectives here, despite the rhetoric, is not simply to protect democracy and human rights. The U.S. has very clear objectives, and this conflict is providing some benefits from the United States as well. First of all, this is splitting Ukraine from Russia. This is creating animosity. That's an objective. But also, as long as the war continues, we see that the Americans are also achieving this disconnect between the Europeans and the Russians. Again, for years now, the Americans have been trying to use European security dependence on the United States to extract economic loyalty. So effectively, stop buying Russian gas, for example. And so, this is not a very well-hidden secret that there are many now in Washington, especially among the neocons, who would like to see Ukraine become sort of a new Afghanistan, something that drains away the resources, gradually weakens Russia, possibly leads towards regime change. Well, again, also forcing the Europeans to have more impose this bloc loyalty, if you will. So I think that this is the main one of the key problems, because even if you cut the Americans out of negotiations, they will not go away for that. If they're not part of it. So the problem is, once Russia goes out, will the Americans and NATO come straight back in? And obviously, this is something that's a big consideration towards the Russians. I guess what they're hoping on is for the US to soften up its stance a bit when they have to take into account other variables. For example, when we push Russia away from Europe, it doesn't end up in isolation. It ends up in the East instead, with China and also now with India, as we now see beyond NATO and Japan, Australia. The rest of the world's not really joining in on this sanction. So they're mainly handing over a huge market to its main rivals. And furthermore, I think maybe they're hoping that Europeans will rein in the Americans a bit as well, because it's not maybe in the Europeans' interest to have this Afghanistan in the center of Europe, that this is not something that is in our interest. So I wouldn't be surprised if you see a bit louder voices coming out of France after a while, suggesting that we have to address this topic of this Cold War legacy, which is the absence of a European security architecture, one that will continue to have these dividing lines in Europe, which will continue to fuel these issues. Because at the moment, this is a divided Europe is now becoming increasingly less and less relevant. The Europeans must retreat under America, and Russia must now retreat more towards China, while Russia would have favored a more diversified economic partnerships. But now, without Europeans and Americans, they have to lean excessively on the Chinese, which is not in the West's interest either. So I think a lot of this possibly can soften up the Americans, but I definitely think that Moscow sees the U.S. as being a key, the main obstacle, if you want, to a permanent settlement in Ukraine.
I agree with that. I would agree with that. I think that the feeling, and not just in Moscow, but I think even in some places in Europe now, is that what the United States is working towards is a war in Ukraine to the last Ukrainian as a way of bleeding Russia. I think that's what the Russians think. I think that's what a lot of the Europeans think. I think it's what the Americans think, and I suspect it's increasingly what many Ukrainians also are thinking. We have to wait and see what kind of a deal is being done. But the more the more information I'm getting is that it looks increasingly also as if Ukraine is preparing to give up the Donbass. That seems to be what the Ukrainian representatives are saying. We haven't seen what this draft that the Ukrainians have put together says, and clearly there's been an awful lot of work in the negotiations going on over the last couple of weeks. So we'll see what it all amounts to and whether or not this is in fact something that the Russians can work with. But can I repeat again, we haven't seen the text. We don't know what exactly has been agreed. We don't know who's giving which ground, but all the indications at the moment are that it's Ukraine that's giving the greater ground at the moment.
All right.
I guess that also makes sense, given that now that Donbass is falling, this is this is a game changer for the Ukrainians. Now, from now on, once Donbass is resolved, and this will not come back, for every day they wait now, they will see Russia strengthens in the other regions, and if they start installing favorable local governments from Kherson to Kharkov, or even Odessa, then these regions might be gradually slip away further and further from Ukraine, moving towards secession in the future. So I really think that the pressure is mounting on Ukraine now to, even though they're not happy with this deal now, that there's a recognition that reality dictates it's either a bad deal today or a worse one tomorrow. So I think this is what's forcing people to the negotiation table.
Exactly. I mean, I should say there's going to be another negotiation tomorrow, another day of negotiations tomorrow. So we'll see what it is. But clearly the Ukrainians have come up with a proposal which the Russians feel that they can work with. And we'll see what it amounts to and whether it comes to anything. But regardless of what happens over Ukraine, the big bifurcation, the great division in the world between the Russian, Chinese, Greater Eurasian Partnership and what's left of the West, I think that's now hardened up. And I'm sure that's something we're going to be discussing at much greater length in future programs, because I could certainly see that this division, which is now, to my mind, I mean, we've now reached a kind of breaking point on it. We'll see, we'll have an awful lot more to discuss about that in the future.
Just it's worth adding also, you mentioned this desire by the Americans perhaps to fight down to the last Ukrainian. I think some in Europe now wondering if the Americans are willing to sanction Russia down to the last euro as well, because Europeans will carry most of the economic burden of these sanctions. We keep talking about isolating Russia, but you see the Europeans are now might isolate themselves. This will have so many consequences. And again, these sanctions are very much, they're causing a lot of pain in Russia, but one has to be realistic. These are once-off sanctions because these market shares will not go back to the West. So I think we forget that Russia sits on a lot of these resources. And in the West, we've had a very neoliberal market efficiency in terms, we're very reliant on these supply chains that we're not used to major disruptions. And this is despite coming out of COVID. And I think for energy, this alone will be a huge problem. This whole idea that we can live without cheap Russian gas. First of all, it's not possible to disconnect from the Russians. And on Thursday, I think that's when they will start petro ruble, and not allowing any more dollars or euro for the gas. I think what we're going to see is if they don't want the Russian gas, if they try to source less LNG from other places. Look what the debates are going on in France now. They're very worried, and of course, Germany with twice the industry. You need cheap energy to have competitive industries. All of the Europe is about to get very expensive, and industries will be very uncompetitive. And that's just energy. If you look at the food shortage, you have the metals like nickel prices. God, what happened? They more than tripled, and of course, at the end you have the currency and the financial system. How is this going to absorb this blow by more and more countries decoupling. I mean, we keep talking about China and Russia, but indeed India is also. They're looking at the pharma industry leaving Russia. They're very eager to come back, come in and replace most of it. China also want a huge chunk of this market share. They're all eager in having energy deals in their local currencies, in rupees, in the Chinese yuan. It's just across the board. The rest of the world is seeing this as a huge opportunity to get in on the Russian market. So I think at some point there will be fragmentations in Europe especially, and I think this idea that this is causing all this solidarity, I think that's the initial reaction in the West. But I think you will see more and more divisions now that economic consequences are starting to come in.
Yes, indeed. I would agree with all. I would agree with all of that. I think the important point to say about the talks today, by the way, is that all that has happened up to now is that the Ukrainians have made a proposal which the Russians have said they will look at. They've not agreed to that proposal. And all that they've done is they said this is a more substantial proposal, a more coherent proposal than that up to now, and that they're scaling down some of their operations around Kiev and Chernigov, which, as I said, is not where the major battle is. Now, we haven't got the details on these proposals yet, but it does seem as if Ukraine is accepting that it's not going to be a member of NATO, though we don't yet know fully what that means and what the detail of this is going to be.
All right. Any final comments before we wrap up this video?
Well, we've been caught on a big day, and I should point out we got negotiations still between the Ukrainians and the Russians tomorrow. These have been very short negotiations today, by the way. I mean, these have only lasted for a couple of hours. So clearly this has been worked on both by the Ukrainians and the Russians for some time. So, we may be a little bit surprised by, things, but clearly things have been in the works for some time. But, we mustn't lose sight of the bigger picture. I think the Ukrainian crisis may be resolved after a fashion now, but, that's not even certain. But the greater picture of global confrontation, the division of the world into blocks, the crisis in the international economy, which is going to deepen, all of that now is fixed and sure. And I'm sure we will be talking with Glenn many times about these issues.
Glenn, any final thoughts? Think Putin is too soft on Europe? A lot of people say that in Russia.
Oh, I know that.
It is true. I mean, Americans, people in the West will be shocked when I say that, but it is true that a lot of people in Russia and a lot of people in the Kremlin see Putin as having too much of a soft spot, especially for Germany, especially for Europe. Yeah. And I know a lot of people are going to say, "What are you talking about? He's super hardliner." Not in Russia.
Yeah, no, that's what people keep missing as well. That he's not this hardliner compared to his colleagues. But I think a lot of Russians would like to see this, like the conflict with the United States will move on. But I think many would be happy to see it come to an end in Ukraine, because I think for many Russians this has been seeing Russians and Ukrainian killing each other has been just excruciating. That this is something that they would want to see an end to as well. I mean, my former head of my department when I worked in Moscow, right before the war, he wrote an article saying that Russia should take this conflict to the puppet master, not the puppet. So in other words, not avoid having a conflict between Russia and Ukraine, instead find ways of putting pressure on the United States to reach some agreement on pan-European security. And I guess I would assume that many Russians have the same sentiment, that they don't like having Ukraine as being the place of a proxy war between Russia and NATO. I pray that this something will come out of these talks, and this horrible chapter of a war in Europe can come to an end. But definitely, I don't think. I think what Russia or Putin then is prepared to do in terms of fighting against the United States and the Europeans, I think we neglected a lot of this, because we keep going back to this assumption that Russia somehow just wants to learn to live with these sanctions until they're let back into Europe. But again, this greater Eurasian partnership they keep talking about, this is this is not just some temporary issue to get around the sanctions. For many in Russia, they see this as being a correction to a 300-year-long mistake, which has been since Peter the Great, this Western-centric foreign policy, that they always had to look towards the West for modernization, but now they have the rise of the East for the first time in a century, and they don't have to rely so much on the West anymore. So I think I think the economic consequences will be immense, and personally, I would prefer to see this take more form of an economic war than a military war. So yes, God willing, this conflict will come to an end soon.
Indeed.
All right.